Last week we spoke about the mind and its nature, what kind of thing a mind is, whether it's physical or something distinct from anything physical. We also considered various computational or computer-inspired approaches to mentality. This week I want to focus on the question of the mind's knowledge of itself, that is, what self-knowledge is and what value it might have for us. Insofar as we're doing that, we'll be combining the discussion we had a couple weeks ago about the nature of knowledge with the discussion we had most recently about the nature of the mind. Now, as a way into the topic of self-knowledge, I want to go back to Plato and his description of Socrates when he was on trial, and the text we'll be focusing on for these purposes will be the text known as the Apology. Socrates is now defending himself against a charge that has been brought against him in a trial in the style of ancient Athens. Now, this dialogue is called the Apology, but Socrates is not apologizing for anything. What he's doing is explaining himself, justifying his lifestyle in response to the accusation that has been brought. So he's now 70 years old. It is now 399 BC. And Socrates is on trial for charges such as the following. Here are some of the charges that have been brought up against him. People have said that he makes the worse argument the stronger. That is, arguments that seem like they should be weak. Socrates seems to have a magical way of making them seem more powerful than they deserve to be. That was number one. Number two, he busies himself studying things in the sky and the earth, was one of the other charges, that somehow Socrates doesn't spend his time doing useful things like making pots or arrows, training to be a soldier or building ships or farming food, raising food on a farm, but rather he just studies things. He uses his mind all day long in the sky and the earth, and that seems somehow idle, I guess, is what the charge was. And then the next charge was he teaches these same things to others, and in the process corrupts people, especially the youth of our city. Socrates, because he had developed a reputation as someone who go to other fellow Athenians and ask them questions about justice and virtue and knowledge and truth, would often show that their answers to his questions were less valid, less worthwhile, less insightful than their holders thought, would often show those people up as being somehow buffoons or confused or overconfident about their own knowledge. And Socrates would often embarrass these people in front of others, even if he didn't do so intentionally. You can see how he would develop a trail of people who felt a little bit resentful towards him. And in the process, he acquired a sort of entourage of generally aristocratic young Athenian men who were fascinated by the conversations that he would have with others and hope to learn from him, as well as to see other people, other Athenians, shown that they don't know as much as they seem to know. And Socrates says that's the charge, and if I actually had knowledge, if I, for example, thought I knew things more than other people, then I'd be, he says, I would pride and preen myself if I had this knowledge. But I don't have this knowledge. I don't have any more knowledge than any of you. In fact, I might even be more ignorant. And Socrates goes on to tell the story of the time that he and his friend Chaerephon went to the oracle at Delphi. The oracle at Delphi is an legendary entity in Greece, in the mountains. You can still go visit it even now. And in ancient Greece, it was a place where priests and priestesses would inhabit a special temple. And according to recent archaeological excavations, we found that there was a crevice at that point in the mountainside over which the temple was built, and occasionally some noxious gas would come out from under that crevice. Apparently, the female the priestess, the Pythian, as the term for her goes, would inhale some of that noxious gas and, I guess, get into an altered state and then proceed to answer a question that was posed for her by a seeker. So in one famous example, this might be a legend. In one example, a general came up to the oracle at Delphi and said he was considering attacking another army, another general's army, and he said, should I go to war against this other general? And the oracle said, if you attack this other army, then a great victory will be had. And then the general was delighted with news, ran down the mountain, got his troops into battle, went to battle, and was soundly defeated by the other army. Now notice the oracle was right. A great victory was had, but it was just a different victory from the one that the general expected to have. So, according to legend, the oracle was always right, was incapable of being mistaken, but would often speak in mysterious ways, in cryptic ways, and the listener, the seeker, would have to work hard to make sure that they were understanding precisely what words were uttered so that they were not misled. So, Socrates says he and his friend Chaerephon went up to the oracle at Delphi, and his friend said to the oracle, "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" And the answer that they were given in return was, no, no one is wiser than Socrates. Now, Socrates goes on and says, I was astonished by this answer. I couldn't believe my ears. I thought that it was amazing. But as we understand what the oracle said and Socrates' interpretation of it, let's ask ourselves precisely what it means to say no one is wiser than Socrates. That does not mean that Socrates is the wisest person in Athens. For example, consider the sentence, no one is taller than George. In the room, suppose we've got a room full of people, and somebody says, no one is taller than George. That does not mean that George is the tallest one in the room, of course, simply because George might be the same height as everybody else in the room. Everybody in the room might be exactly 5 feet, 5 and 7 inches tall, just like George, and still it's true that no one is taller than George. So likewise, the fact that no one is wiser than Socrates might just be because, for example, every Athenian is equally ignorant, including Socrates, therefore no one is wiser than he is. So Socrates was astonished by this answer from the oracle, and he asks himself, what does the god mean? What is his riddle? So he says, I went to one of those reputed wise. I was going to try to prove that the oracle was wrong. And I went to people who said they were, or other people told me that they were very wise, and found and asked them how much they know. That is to say, I went to, for example, the generals and asked them what they knew and didn't find that they were particularly wise about how to conduct warfare or carry on the protection of the state. And I went to the craftsmen and asked them about what they know, and they were not able to articulate their knowledge with any kind of effect or effectiveness, and so I felt that they were not particularly wise. I went to the poets and asked them what sort of wisdom they use when they write their poetry, and they were not able to answer my question. And so I also noticed, Socrates says that sometimes we find people who take themselves to have knowledge, and even if they don't, they consider themselves to be wise even when they're actually ignorant. So Socrates says, that's not true of me. I'm ignorant and I know that I am. And so he goes on, I'm likely to be wiser than others to this small extent. I don't think that I know what I don't know. I don't preen myself. I don't pretend to have knowledge that I lack. And so when Socrates says, I might have a slight advantage over other Athenians, perhaps we're all equally ignorant of the important matters such as virtue and wisdom and justice and how to carry on our lives in a proper way and so on, but at least I'm not under any illusions, whereas many of my fellow Athenians seem to be under illusions because they take themselves to know the answers to these questions, whereas I'm aware of the fact that I don't, and probably no one else does either. So as we stand back from Socrates' remarks here, we can infer that Socrates has something to say that we might refer to under the rubric of wisdom. Being wise is more than knowing lots of things. It's also a matter of having an accurate assessment of yourself, including your own limitation. So someone who's wise might still be fairly ignorant and yet be aware of some important things, including their own limitations, as well as know how to use the knowledge that they do have in an appropriate, effective, and useful manner. So Socrates says, I continued to try to disprove the oracle. I proceeded systematically. I went to the politicians and the poets and the craftsmen, and I asked them what they knew and found that their answers were unsatisfactory. And so Socrates goes on, I became unpopular. And I live in great poverty even now because of my service to the god. My service to the god was to try to disprove his or its answer to the question whether I'm the wisest one or if anybody is wiser than I am. And I at least can see that some young men, the entourage that I've acquired following me around when I ask other people questions, they follow my example. They don't pretend to be wise. They are acknowledging their ignorance, and that might be what makes you think, you fellow Athenians, think that I'm corrupting the youth of Athens, but I don't think that I am. I'm actually just helping them see what is in fact the case. So Socrates now goes to Miletus, speaks to Miletus, one of the main accusers against him, and he says, Miletus, here's one of your accusations against me. You say, Socrates corrupts the youth of Athens and doesn't believe in the gods of our city, but rather in other gods. And Socrates denies that he believes in any other gods, and he doesn't think he's corrupting the youth of Athens. If anything, he thinks he's clarifying and helping them see what is in fact the case. But Socrates proceeds to question Meletus, and here is what I want to mention as a good example of what we now call Socratic method. In Socratic method, we draw out of a person what we think of as being already inside of them. We don't tell them anything new. We try to just elucidate ideas that are already inside of them, just as Socrates had done in his discussion with Minos' slave boy. So Socrates says to Meletus, "Who do you think improves the youth around here or anywhere?" And Meletus replies, perhaps meanly, "Everyone improves the youth except for you." Socrates responds, "Okay, well, who improves horses?" And Meletus replies, "Well, horse trainers, of course." Socrates asks, "Do the wicked, if someone is wicked, do they do harm? And do good people benefit others? That is, are the wicked harmful and the good people beneficial?" And Meletus says, "Yes, they are." "Well," Socrates says, "would anyone willingly want to harm or be harmed? In particular, would anybody desire to be on the receiving end of some harm?" Meletus says, "No." I guess he's not considering the possibility of masochists, for example. And Socrates goes on, "Well, do I corrupt the youth deliberately? Am I actually trying to corrupt them?" Meletus says, "Yes, you are. I think you actually are deliberately corrupting the youth." Socrates replies, "But then if I corrupt youth, I risk harming myself because my own well-being depends upon the well-being of the people that are around me." And Meletus doesn't have a very satisfactory answer to this. And Socrates remarks also in this area of the apology that even though he's in danger of being put to death as a result of this trial, depending upon how the jury votes for or against him, he remarks, "To fear death is to think oneself wise when one is not." Presumably because to fear death is to have some presumptions about what you think is going to happen after the destruction of your body. But Socrates says, "I have no idea what will happen after my body is destroyed. Maybe there will be a me that persists that event or not, I don't know. But to fear death requires a presupposition that I think something bad is likely to happen to me, and I'm ignorant of the question what's going to happen to me at the destruction of my body. So even if I were to fear death, I would be acting as if I have some wisdom that I in fact don't have any right to claim. I'd be acting, presenting myself as having knowledge that I don't in fact have." Another important dimension of the apology is the following. It was widely understood that if you were on trial in ancient Athens, and I should mention, by the way, that in those days your jury consisted of 501 of your fellow Athenians, all of whom had to be landowners, so this was a highly elitist society by contemporary standards, and these 501 jurors would sit in a sort of auditorium watching you make your defense and considering other things that would happen as be brought forward as evidence concerning your trial. But often what would happen would be the person who has been accused, the defendant, would bring their family onto the stage in front of everybody and beg for mercy, tear their clothes, pour ashes over their head, that kind of thing, and supplicate themselves to the jury, and often the jury would respond with a relatively lenient sentence. Socrates is not willing to do that. He's not willing to give up on any of his principles, any of the things that he thinks are important about his life. He knows, for example, that if he were to promise to stop going around the agora, stop asking people questions about truth and justice and virtue and knowledge, that his jurors would probably let him off with a fairly light sentence on the condition that he stopped asking these philosophical questions. But he says, "I'm not going to stop doing philosophy just in order to be acquitted." He says, "Men of Athens, I'm grateful and I'm your friend, but I will obey the god," that is the god that gave him his answer at the oracle, "rather than you. And as long as I draw breath and am able, I'm going to exhort you in my usual way." So it's referring to the idea that he could probably get a light sentence if he promised not to stop talking philosophy with others, but he's not willing to do that because he thinks that this is essentially his mission in life, is to understand and seek for answers to these questions. He remarks at one point that he thinks that he was attached to the city by the god like a gadfly to a noble steed. A gadfly might make a noble steed run around, move, get more excited, perhaps more agitated, and Socrates wants to do the same thing to the city of Athens, whose citizens he thinks have become perhaps a little bit lazy, dogmatic, self-satisfied, complacent. He wants to try to provoke people to get them to think harder about the questions that are important. And at this point he also remarks, the unexamined life is not worth living. one of the most famous remarks in all of Western philosophy, the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, in spite of the fact that the claim that the unexamined life is not worth living is one of the most famous remarks in Western philosophy, if you think about it, even if it's familiar, familiarity does often bring contentment. Even though it's familiar, it's actually quite controversial. That is to say, on its most direct and simple-minded interpretation, the unexamined life is not worth living seems to imply that if you don't engage in self-examination, your life is not worth living, in the sense it seems that it would have been better had you not been born in the first place. So think about a stark example of a life that's not worth living. Suppose that there's been a little baby born, and she's born with a terrible congenital disease that doctors do not know how to cure. She seems to be in constant pain. In the course of her life, she's never able to show or experience any emotions that we know of. She never seems to smile back at people when they smile at her. She seems to cry most of the time. She just seems very uncomfortable. And then after 6 months, she passes away. Now, here's an example in which we might very well say, following the bioethicists who use the term zero line, that this baby has never gotten above the zero line being a line below which, if you never get above that line, your life is not worth living. It would have been better if the baby had never been born. All she did was suffer. You can understand, I think, how somebody might take that view. That's not uncontroversial, but you can understand why somebody might think that's a reasonable view about a person whose life has gone like that. Whereas most of us, with most of our lives, even if we do experience pain and discomfort, depression, upset, and disappointment, most of us would say, in spite of that, we're well above the zero line. Likewise, even if you don't engage in self-examination, it's hard to see how that would make you go below the zero line. So consider an example such as Maria, who's a campaigner working to protect women in the little Eastern European country of Moldova, one of the poorest countries in Europe. And Maria wants to protect women in Moldova because it's not, as is now well known, there's a problem of prostitution and sexual slavery that starts out in places like Moldova. Young women get lured by essentially pimps to come to their small towns in the countryside and say, hey, I've got a wonderful job for you in Paris or in London or Berlin, Budapest, in which you'll be working at a boutique and so forth. Just come with me. I'll carry your passport with me and take good care of it to make sure it's safe, and I'll set you up in a nice cushy job in one of these boutiques in a big city. All too often what happens is that they give up their passport all right, and then the pimp in question forces them into a form of sexual slavery, and they are often never seen again. So Maria's goal in life is to try to let young women who might be preyed upon by these pimps to watch out for them and not believe what they say, in spite of their nice suits and flashy cars, that they're just going to, in fact, what they're going to do is just exploit these women. So suppose Maria is a dedicated campaigner. She spends all of her waking time doing what she can to keep young women in Moldova from being lured by men into this kind of trap. And you feel like perhaps she's so tired at the end of the day that she doesn't have time to engage in any self-examination. And yet it seems awfully strange to say, even though Maria does not live an examined life in the way that Socrates might envision, that therefore her life is not worth living. That seems very high-handed, perhaps too intellectual. And just as the case with Maria, so too you can think of many, many lives that are worthwhile because someone contributes to somebody else's well-being, does something that helps out the world in some way, even though that comes naturally to them. It's not something that they plan or think about or philosophize about. It's just something that they do instinctively almost. And nevertheless, it seems like their life is worth living, even though they don't engage in self-examination. So the most simple-minded and strict interpretation of the claim that the unexamined life is not worth living seems implausible to many. Seems like it just is too demanding and rules out as valueless and below the zero line the lives of many, many people, perhaps even the majority of people who are alive right now, who just don't have the time or the energy or the resources to engage in examination or self-examination of the sorts of Socrates counsels. Now here's another interpretation that is offered by Professor Richard Kraut of Northwestern University, who's a specialist in the work of Plato and Aristotle, as well as Socrates, their teacher. Professor Kraut suggests that we should reread the phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living. If we look at the original Greek, we find the word biotos, which translates as to be lived. And on that interpretation, we understand the unexamined life is not worth living as really meaning the unexamined life is not to be lived. You're missing out on something of value if you fail to engage in self-examination, which does not mean that your life is without value, but rather there's a hole there. There's something missing that anybody who lives a full life should be wanting to fill. So I was once listening to the radio and the DJ came on and after a song finished and said, "If you don't dig that music, you've got a hole in your soul." And I was struck by that remark because it suggested that, yeah, if you fail to appreciate music of that kind, that might have been a certain kind of jazz, I don't remember exactly what music was on at the time. If you don't appreciate that kind of music, then you're missing something that any full, satisfying life would have in it. And so likewise, if you don't engage in self-examination, your life can still be worthwhile, but still missing, but still without something important, just as you can live a worthwhile life and a valuable life in which you don't engage in or appreciate or experience any love. A life without love is still a life that might be worth living, and yet is missing something significant and of great value. Now, Kraut goes on and points out that many of the characters in some of the most famous dialogues, other Socratic dialogues and Platonic dialogues that we won't be discussing in this class, still exemplify ways in which people might fail to engage in valuable self-examination. So for instance, in fact, one of the dialogues that's in our book for this semester, the Euthyphro, is an example in which Socrates confronts his friend Euthyphro. Euthyphro is about to go into one of the law courts, and Socrates says to his friend Euthyphro, "Hey, what's up? What are you doing here at one of the law courts? I know I'm on trial, but what brings you here?" Euthyphro says, "Well, I'm prosecuting my father." And Socrates says, "Really? We were prosecuting your father. Why are you doing that?" And Euthyphro replies, "Well, because he killed one of our employees, and I think he needs to be prosecuted for that." And Socrates, knowing full well that it's awfully unusual for one family member to take another family member to court, even when there's been a murder that has occurred, is quite surprised by this answer. And then he continues to ask Euthyphro, "Well, you must know what justice and virtue and right action are." And Euthyphro says, You're right, I do know what these things are and what their basis is. But Socrates, after a couple more pages, shows Euthyphro that he's not really clear on what those things are. He shows Euthyphro as really more dogmatic than anything else, and thereby shows Euthyphro has not been engaging in appropriate self-examination. As a result, Euthyphro is in danger of doing something that's highly improper and ill-advised. It may be the case that he's mistaken in prosecuting his father for something that has happened. We're not given an answer to that question, but Socrates makes clear that Euthyphro has, at best, a very partial and incomplete grasp on the nature of right and wrong. And this is a result of being dogmatic rather than asking himself what is right and what is wrong. Likewise, later on in the series of events that is roughly represented by the 5 Dialogues book that we have for this semester, Socrates has now been put in prison. He's been accused and charged and convicted of the crime of corrupting the youth and various other things. He's now in prison, has been sentenced to death. He's waiting for the day on which he's going to have to get his death sentence or actually be put to death. And his friend Crito comes along very early one morning and says, "Socrates, it's early. Let's hurry. Gather together your things. I'm going to help you escape. I'm able to bribe the appropriate guards. We can get out of here under disguise, and we just need to go, and no one will make such a big deal out of it. And besides, if I don't help you escape, then given that everybody knows that I've got enough money to pay off the jailers, bribe them, and help you escape, if you don't let me help you escape, I'll be embarrassed because people will say I was too cheap to help you to get out of jail." Socrates responds, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to escape just because you're worried about being embarrassed. If I want to get out of jail, I will explain to the world why I'm justified in doing so. But on the other hand, if I think that it's right for me to be put to death under these conditions, I'll just stay right here. I'm not going to pay attention to the question whether or not you're in danger of being embarrassed." So Crito, again, is an example of someone who is, according to Socrates, living an insufficiently examined life because he's motivated more by the fear of being embarrassed than he is by doing what he thinks is right. Third example, Ion, in a dialogue known as Ion, I-O-N, is an example of what's known as a rhapsode. He is known for going around ancient Greece and reciting Homer, reciting the Odyssey. and telling people great stories from Homer's Odyssey. Now, Ion just is a empty vessel, so to speak. He just repeats the lines from the poem. There's no reason to think he has any understanding of what happens in the story. And as a result, he is another example of a person who fails to engage in self-examination. He just mouths the lines without trying to figure out what they mean, what their significance is, whether they're plausible or not. And the final example is Glaucon, Glaucon, from Plato's Republic. Glaucon asks Socrates, when they're trying to figure out what the best kind of life to live is, Glaucon says, look, if I had a ring that could make me invisible, what's referred to in the story, what's now referred back to as the ring of Gyges. If I had such a ring that could make me invisible, of course I'd use it. Of course I'd use it to gain an advantage over other people, steal things with no repercussions, get into places that I wouldn't otherwise be able to get into. And likewise, if you had an analog of the ring of Gyges, suppose you had, for example, unlimited hacker ability so that you could hack into any website that you wanted to, including those websites that hold your transcripts, for example, your GRE scores, your LSAT scores, what have you. If you might be very tempted by that prospect. Socrates says, if you are tempted by the prospect of getting power and wealth and glory and so forth in this cheating way, then you are also engaging in an insufficient amount of self-examination precisely because you are not thinking about the repercussions of gaining things in that way. If you were to end up at the top of the world by those illegitimate means, I think Socrates would suggest, you will find that be an empty victory. And as a result, you haven't examined your own life and the things that value as much as you should. So Socrates' point here is the following. Each of these characters, Euthyphro, Crito, Ion, and Glaucon, are examples of people who engage in an insufficient amount of self-examination. They are living lives that are still worthwhile, but they are living lives that are not to be lived. They're missing something of value precisely because they're not reflecting on many of the presuppositions with which they're acting. So too, you might think about whether or not you know an example of someone, an actual person in your life or a fictional character you've come across in some of your reading or movies you've watched, poems you've read, plays you've seen, any such person who could do with more self-examination, so, more of an ability to think about the things that motivate them to do the things that they do, to pursue the things that they're pursuing, and ask whether those are actually worthwhile, valuable aims to have. Can you think of anybody who could do with more self-examination? Now, on Kraut's interpretation of the unexamined life is not worth living idea, we have what you might think of as a hierarchical view of the value that a life can have and the value of self-examination, such as it's capable of producing such a life. Think of Kraut's view as a hierarchical view in the following sense, that you could be at a reasonably moderate level of fulfillment and value in life by engaging in minimal or no self-examination, but you'd be missing something. Just as you could live a perfectly decent life, but if you don't have love, then that life will be missing something that most of us would consider to be a valuable part of any full life. Notice this hierarchical view is one that we can distinguish from what you might call a pluralist view, where a pluralist view can say there are many things that make life valuable, but a single life can be completely and fully valuable without having all of those inside of it. So somebody might say, look, I just love playing music, and I want to play music, and I want to compose music, and I want to listen to music, but I don't want to engage in self-examination. I don't want to engage in any of that self-analysis that the philosophers are suggesting that we do. That's fine for other people, it's not for me. If you're a pluralist, then you'll say of that music person, the person who's obsessed with music and who loves music and is apparently very happy playing and enjoying all the music that she can, that if you're a hierarchical person, you'll say that person has a hole in their soul, they're missing something of value, even if they think that they're not. Whereas if you're a pluralist, you'll say, fine. There are many different ways of living a full life. Being a musician is one. Being a self-examining philosophy type is another. Being someone who loves to travel is the third way. You can travel and get all kinds of interesting experiences by going around the world and seeing different cultures, different societies, different types of people, different kinds of architecture, different types of landscape. And if you don't engage in self-examination, that's all right, so long as you live a full life. you can do that without doing the self-examination that Socrates is suggesting on this interpretation. So we have the strictest reading of the unexamined life is not worth living view, according to which if you don't engage in self-examination, your life is below the zero line. We've got the more moderate notion of self-examination, that is the one propounded by Kraut, who says you can live a life above the zero line even if you don't engage in self-examination, but your life will be missing something that any full life would need to have to count as full. And then there's the what you might call pluralist view that says there are lots of different ways of living perfectly full lives, only some of which involve self-examination. But you can live a perfectly full life, not missing anything of value, so long, even without engaging in self-examination, so long as you do what you love. So I want you to think about which of those three different interpretations concerning the unexamined life is the one that you find most plausible, and think about how you'd go about defending your answer to that question as best you could. And I want to suggest that I suspect Kraut would say that the pluralist is propounding a way of living that is in a way, so to speak, fragile. That is, if you don't engage in self-examination, you might get lucky and live a life that's full. But I think he'd probably argue that it's also the case that you could be unlucky and have your life motivated, activated by principles that are not ones that on reflection you would think are necessarily the best. So for example, think about some ways in which we do things that are sometimes puzzling to us. I've often asked my students, if you could understand something about yourself that you can't figure out, what is it that you'd like to understand? An answer I often get is, for example, students would like to know why they are so often likely to procrastinate. Why do I procrastinate when I've got an assignment due? Why do I always put it off to the last minute? And I don't have an answer to the question that applies to all students, but one thing that I've noticed in some of my students and some of my friends when I was growing up particularly was the following kind of psychological characteristic. Some people often present themselves as being very flaky, as being someone who always puts things off to the last minute. And then when they turn in an assignment and they get a mediocre grade on it, they can always say, yeah, well, I was a flake, I should have started earlier, I only turned it in late, so I should be lucky with the grade that I've got. Notice that someone who does something like that might, I don't say necessarily is, but might be protecting a hidden belief about themselves. That is, they might have a hidden belief that they're great, that they're extremely talented, brilliant, incredibly gifted at something. But that if they never put that belief about themselves to the test by giving themselves a chance to try something and give it their very best shot, start early and revise and edit and revise and improve and spit shine and so forth, and then do your very best and submit what you think is your very best work, that puts you in danger of still getting a B- or something of the kind after giving it your best shot. And if that happens, that's going to probably puncture your very high self-image about your own talents. So my impression has been that sometimes people who want to preserve and never have to challenge their own very high self-image about some aspects of their own talents can always protect that by never giving something the best shot, always being a little bit lackadaisical about something, always being late or disorganized or flaky in some form or another. And then when they don't do well, can always say, yeah, well, I guess I'm a flake, I guess didn't have my act together, I'll try harder next time, knowing full well on some level that they never will, or it may take a long time before they do so, simply because they've strongly motivated not to give something their best shot, because giving something your very best shot sometimes requires putting some aspect of yourself on the line, up for potential test, and perhaps showing that you're not quite as talented as you thought you were. Another example is, many people often, we talked about in the discussion of deontological ethics, the possibility of using someone as a mere means as opposed to just as a means, or as opposed to as a means. And someone can get into the habit of using others as means to their own purposes, and more precisely as mere means, without always paying attention to the fact that they're doing so. Somebody's life might be permeated by their capacity and tendency to use others in a way that's potentially exploitative. If they don't engage in self-examination, they might never find that out about themselves and engage in any kind of constructive change. Another example, in recent pop culture, some of you might have noticed the term humble brag. That is a term that was coined recently by people thinking that there's a phenomenon in which somebody is bragging about themselves, but doing so under the guise of complaining or whining about something, about some difficulty they're having. So suppose you're in your senior year of college and you've got a friend who comes to you and says, "It is so difficult, I do not know what to do. It's just a terrible situation I'm in." And you say, "What is it?" And they reply, "Well, here's the problem. I can't decide whether to accept a job with Microsoft or with Google. What should I do? It's terrible." You might be turning green at the gills with jealousy with someone like that, because those might very well be very attractive jobs. The person is presumably bragging about these wonderful job offers that they have, but putting it forth as a complaint, as a way of coming across as about their own problems, about how humble they are. And again, the Socratic idea, as propounded by someone like Kraut, is going to be, if only they were to engage in some self-examination, they might become aware of the fact that their seeming complaint, their seeming whining, is really motivated by a desire to brag. And that might get them to change their behavior as a result. The suggestion here is then that the pluralist doesn't give us any clear way of suggesting that such a person could and should and would benefit from more self-examination to make their behavior more appropriate and useful and helpful for others. Instead, what they do is they keep on in the path that they're sticking in, and perhaps might go like that and behave like that for the rest of their lives. That's the suggestion that, therefore, the pluralist is in danger of propounding lives, supporting lives that are too fragile. You might get lucky and live a good life, or you might get unlucky and be routed and routinized into habits that are not productive for you and not productive for others. That's one way of thinking about a possible criticism of the pluralist view in favor of the more hierarchical view of the value of self-examination. At this point, you might ask, okay, I'm convinced by the value of self-examination. By engaging a certain amount of self-examination, I can see that I'd stand a better chance of not being routed into or canalized into forms of behavior that are not productive for me or for the people that I care about. But how does self-examination exactly help me with those things? Isn't self-examination introspection, navel-gazing, etc.? And that picture of what self-examination is suggested by, for example, Descartes' view of his own mind and how he's able to know it. So remember, back from one of the early meditations, he asks himself, what kind of thing am I then? And his answer is, well, a thing that thinks. And he says, well, what is that? His answer is a thing that doubts and understands and affirms and denies and wills and refuses, and that also imagines and senses. And Descartes' position seems to be that self-examination is the same as introspection. What there is to examine is the current contents of my own mind. What thoughts I'm thinking, what emotions I'm feeling, what experiences that I'm having, etc. Now, that Cartesian picture of self-knowledge has had a very large impact on Western philosophy subsequent to Descartes' own writing. But if we think about Socrates, I'm going to suggest that self-understanding, self-examination is something very different. It's not so much for Socrates about introspecting and finding out what's inside the contents of your immediately introspectable, available mind, so to speak, to the mind's eye, but rather self-examination is more a matter of thinking through the consequences of my ideas about, for example, justice and truth and right and wrong, and seeing where they lead, and thereby perhaps revising my own opinions in light of finding that certain commitments that I had earlier on are ones that result in conclusions that are not satisfactory to me, that are perhaps noxious or surprising. So you might say, for example, when I first heard about utilitarianism, it seemed like an obvious theory, almost too obvious to be worth mentioning. And then as I saw that its consequences included things such as doing terrible things to an innocent person in order to maximize utility, I then realized that I'm not a utilitarian after all. Now Socrates would say, right, exactly, good example of how self-examination is possible without introspection. You're not so much introspecting, rather you're engaging in dialogue with others, hopefully, and in the course of doing so, drawing out conclusions from your own preconceptions and assumptions, and seeing that, in fact, deep down, you don't accept a utilitarian theory of right and wrong. Or likewise, you might think about, well, when I first heard about empiricism, it seemed too obvious to be worth mentioning, but now that I think through its consequences, I find that maybe I'm not an empiricist after all. I thought I was, because I love science, you might say. But I'm not an empiricist after all, because I don't think that all knowledge comes from and only from the senses, now that I think about precisely what that means and what its implications are. So Socrates would say, Self-examination is not navel-gazing. Rather, it's thinking about our ideas and our views, drawing out their consequences, seeing where they lead, and seeing whether we need to revise our own opinions in light of those conclusions. That's one important aspect of self-examination that Socrates would want you to think about. A more contemporary aspect of self-examination is not so much about introspection, but rather about seeing some of the implications of our perhaps unconscious states in our behavior and seeing whether there's anything we can do about them. So think about, this is a topic that's certainly been on the public airwaves over the last couple of years. Think about various kinds of biases, including racism and sexism. It is still quite possible to find people who are avowedly, self-consciously racist and self-consciously sexist, who've got gender biases of all kinds, biases of various other kinds, that make them bigoted in one form or another, as most of us would say. Many people, that is, have views that they can introspect upon. They can report honestly that they hold that, for example, having a certain skin color or gender makes a difference to what kinds of rights or status or qualifications you have for a job or an education or something else. However, the numbers of those people are perhaps dwindling, and yet recent experimental psychology has shown that that does not mean that the overall amount of racism, sexism, various other kinds of bias have dwindled either. The reason is that some biases might well be at the unconscious level, at a level of our behavior, level of our mentality, that is not available to introspection. So, according to recent experimental psychology, I can introspect and tell whether or not I've got an ache in my left ankle, and I can introspect and tell whether or not I'm hungry. Maybe I can introspect and tell whether or not I'm sad. But I can't introspect and determine decisively whether or not I am biased against people with a different skin color from my own. This falls under the rubric that is now referred to as implicit bias. And the phenomenon of implicit bias is as follows. I might hold biases that I can't know by introspecting. And you might ask, well, how can you know about them? Answer is, I can know because they have implications in my behavior, according to which the best explanation of why I behave in the way that I do is that I must have an unconscious assumption or set of assumptions, preconceptions or expectations about people of, for example, a certain skin color or a certain gender or a certain ethnicity. And the Project Implicit, you can find a website by that name and actually take a test to see whether or not you harbor implicit biases. Project Implicit tries to show us that even if we self-consciously look inside and don't find that we are consciously harboring, introspectively harboring any biases toward anybody else, we might still be biased, not in a way that we can know by introspection, but rather in ways that we can know by virtue of how we behave. So to take a simple example, suppose that subliminally I've been primed, that is, for just perhaps 100 milliseconds, I'm shown a picture of, for example, a Caucasian face. And I'm then presented, and I'm not conscious of ever having seen any face at that level. And I'm presented with visual scenes, one of which, I'm told a story in which I'm just coming back home from a party, and I'm walking, and I'm shown two different scenes, one of which shows me a perfectly well-lit street with fair bit of life going on it, and another one, a relatively somberly lit, partially lit, alley-like thing that doesn't look extremely dangerous, but looks not quite as inviting as the well-lit street that I had seen first. Now, if I've been primed subliminally with the Caucasian face, I might have certain probabilities with which I would say I'd choose one street over the other. But experiments show that if I've been primed by being shown an African-American face, then I'm much more likely to choose to go down the well-lit street than the poorly lit street. The suggestion being that it might be that being primed at the unconscious level by the African-American face makes me feel more in danger, more threatened. And as a result, I'm more likely to choose something that is more likely to be safe than something that is perhaps a little more sketchy, risky, or possibly dangerous. The best explanation, if that's what happens to me is when I'm an experimental subject, the best explanation of that difference in my choices as to which street I'm willing to go down is presumably that skin color makes a difference to how safe or unsafe I feel, but not in a way that I'm conscious of. That's an example of implicit bias. You can find implicit biases in yourself on issues of race, of issues of gender, of issues of body type. That is, you can be subliminally primed with images of people of different shapes of their bodies or disabilities, and thereby be shown that you harbor expectations of one kind or another that suggest that people with different, for example, physical characteristics from what you consider to be normal, perhaps make more salient and activated in your mind the possibility of threat or danger, suggesting bias. So now, introspection won't give you answers to the question, or complete and convincing answers to the question whether or not you have any biases, prejudices, things of the kind. And yet, should be shown that you behave in ways that can only be explained, or best be explained, by the assumption that you hold biases of a various kind. Now, going back not so much to Descartes, but to his rival, Ryle, who said, remember, stupid is as stupid does or tends to do, smart is as smart does or tends to do, so too, biased is as smart does or tends to do. That is, your bias is right there in your behavior. Even if you can't find it by introspection, you can find it by looking at yourself from, so to speak, a third-person point of view rather than from a first-person point of view. You can't know about the bias by introspection, but you can know about that bias by how you behave under certain controlled experimental situations. And as a result, you can learn about yourself by looking, so to speak, outward rather than looking inward. So if what we've discussed so far is roughly on the right track, then our conclusion should be, you don't know your mind. You don't engage in self-examination so much by introspection. Introspection tells you whether you're hungry and whether you've got an ache in your left ankle. But it doesn't tell you whether or not you're racist. It doesn't tell you whether or not you're sexist. It doesn't tell you whether you're biased towards people who have disabilities, for example. And likewise, introspection doesn't tell you what you think about right and wrong, justice, knowledge, etc. These are things that are not available to introspection as far as we can tell. Rather, you engage in self-examination to determine what your views are about right and wrong by engaging in dialogue and inquiry and debate. That is roughly the things that philosophy tries to cultivate. That's how you find out whether you're an empiricist or a rationalist, or whether you believe the mind is distinct from or identical with the body. That's how you find out what the nature of justice and right and wrong are, for instance, by seeing a starting point, trying out different theories and seeing how they apply to your intuitions with regard to the consequences that they generate. Likewise, you don't find out about whether you're biased by introspecting. You see how you behave in actual or hypothetical circumstances, such as those that are created by an experimental setup. So then introspection should not be identified or confused with self-examination. Self-examination involves looking at what you do in both conversation and debate on the one hand, and behavior in response to the external environment. So just as people will say, you don't know whether you like something until you've tried it, seems like we should also say, you don't know what you think until you've, for example, heard yourself talk about a certain topic. And you don't know how you view certain other people until you've seen how you behave towards them in situations where the going gets rough, where tough choices have to be made. That's when we show our true colors, it seems to me, and I think it seems to much of the philosophical tradition that sets its face against, at least, a Cartesian way of thinking about self-knowledge, which seems to focus on introspection. So that's one important point that I think is worth dwelling on for a little bit and letting it sink in your own thinking. A second point is the following. Suppose you find that you are not happy. You go to Project Implicit and take the test, and you find you're not particularly pleased about the fact that you do seem to harbor some implicit biases. Well, given that these biases are not things that you can determine by introspection, what can you do about them? Is it possible to change them? Well, this is a topic for contemporary discussion. There's research going on right now about how to make changes in the implicit level of your mind because they're not consciously accessible. And I want to suggest as a broad line of approach to how you might go about changing, that change can be brought about largely by behavioral means rather than by changing your views, changing your thinking, changing your theory about things. So in the case at least of biases, for instance, that might plague us and make us do things we prefer not to be doing, as opposed to our answers to philosophical questions about justice and right and wrong. about biases, we might be able to overcome those biases by behaving in ways that allow us to perhaps, if not erase them, then at least to minimize their implications for our behavior. So that if you find that you're biased towards people with disabilities, in spite of the fact that you would rather not be, one way of trying to change some of that bias might be to expose yourself, interact with, try to get involved in activities that include people with disabilities in order to try to understand them from close up rather than from just far away. So again, back to Ryle, changing your mind in this area is not so much about contemplating a proposition and deciding what you think about it or judging it to be true or judging it to be false, but changing your behavior and your dispositions to behavior so that when you're confronted with someone who has prosthetic limbs, for example, even if your initial reaction sometime in the past was that of a revulsion, you get over that and you find yourself perfectly comfortable and not even thinking twice about someone who's got a disability compared to what kind of body type you've got. So changing the nature of your mind, as it were, is not so much a matter of a conscious, deliberate, contemplative action as it is doing something new, doing something different, and modifying your behavior accordingly. And one thing I want to bring open onto the table now as a way of preparing us to discuss the nature of personhood and personal identity next week is the following. Some philosophers have argued that one thing that distinguishes members of our species from others is that we're able to look at ourselves in the sense of take stock of our dispositions, tendencies, predilections, predispositions, and so on, and ask ourselves whether those are the kinds of things we want to continue to have. That is, think of your will as being a set of tendencies to behave in certain ways. My will is such as to prefer one type of cookie over another. My will is such as to like to get lots of exercise and be in the outdoors whenever I can. I've got a number of preferences, ways of behaving that guide my activity. I might find, however, that aspects of my will are things that I don't endorse completely. There are things about my will that I wish I didn't have. I wish I didn't have as much of a predilection for certain kinds of cookies as I actually do have. I wish I could make myself do the things I know are chores but I know need to get done, for example. I wish I had stronger will about some of those things. Now, it's been argued that some aspects of what makes us human distinct from other species is our capacity not just to notice that we have a will, but to make efforts, at least in some cases, to modify that will, to introspect or to learn about ourselves by not so much introspection, but by the broader, more behavioral notion of self-examination, and ask ourselves, well, I'm phobic about that kind of thing, or I'm too anxious about that kind of thing, or I'm obsessed with these issues, or I'm too likely to take offense at somebody's comments about certain aspects of myself. But I don't like those things about me. I'd like to change those things about myself. Some philosophers have argued that you can go about changing those aspects of yourself by exercising freedom of will in the sense of changing your will, changing the will that you have that guides you to behave in the ways that you do. This is a change that might be painstaking, might take years, but is one that's worth the effort. Just as, if you recall, Pascal said, look, I can't, even if you accept my wager argument as being convincing enough to show you that it's rational to believe in God, I can't just make you expect that you can snap your fingers and become a theist. But what I can do is ask you to surround yourself with theists, get rid of your non-theistic ways of thinking, including your books and your music, etc. Stop associating with skeptical people, hang out with people who are religious, and after a while, as William James later said, faith will come to stupefy your scruples. So too, if you change your behavior in the right way, at least, you might find yourself overcoming some aspects of your will and thereby modifying some aspects of your will that you don't like. So self-knowledge, which is what self-examination attempts to achieve, self-knowledge can be valuable because it can allow you to understand some aspects of yourself, some of which you might be happy with, others of which you might be unhappy with. And those aspects of yourself that you're unhappy with, you might ask, how can I change those things? If this Rylean perspective, this knowing yourself by looking outside, taking a third-person perspective on yourself is appropriate, then the suggestion that offers is, well then, change yourself in a kind of Rileyan way by changing your behaviors and your dispositions to behavior. And that means, for example, spending more time with people with disabilities in order to overcome your revulsion if you have it. Spending more time with people of different races in order to overcome what might be an implicit prejudice against people of different race from your own. Try to acquire a taste for example, a kind of music that you don't have a taste for yet in order to make yourself be someone who enjoys that kind of music, or at least to give it a fair shake, to give it a try, to see whether it's possible to acquire a taste for it. You might find that the effort's not worth it, but at least you'll have given it a fair shot, as opposed to being the sort of person that the pluralist seems to be suggesting about the value of self-examination, namely, follow your path and hope, good luck, hope you end up being happy. And the more hierarchical view, insofar as we say that self-examination is a part of any full life, that one aspect of the value of self-examination is that it puts you in a better position to ask yourself, okay, here's the kind of will that I've got. Here are the set of predilections that tend to guide my behavior from day to day. Maybe many of those I'm happy with, but some of them I might not be. Maybe I procrastinate. Maybe I tend to be a little bit of a loudmouth. Maybe I'm not good at keeping secrets. Maybe I tend to be impulsive. Are there things about myself that I can change? Perhaps. But the change is not a matter of introspecting and deciding I'm not going to think those thoughts anymore, but rather modifying my behavior. And that's a modification that might take time, require a lot of painstaking effort and patience, but I suspect that Socrates would argue that it's worth the effort and worth the wait.